The helicopter blades cut through the thick mountain air as we approached Outpost 117. Through the swirling snow, I caught my first glimpse of what would become my new home, or my prison. Massive concrete structures jutted from the mountainside like ancient monoliths, their surfaces scarred by decades of harsh weather. Electric fences stretched into the mist, their metal poles disappearing into the white void beyond. I'm Private Logan Mercer, and this was my first deployment. The briefing had been vague. A classified research facility in the Cascadian Mountains, minimal contact with the outside world, and a mission so secret that even my commanding officers seemed uncomfortable discussing it. The pilot hadn't said a word since takeoff, and the other two soldiers aboard kept their eyes fixed on the floor. As we touched down on the helipad, the full scale of the facility became apparent. Outpost 117 wasn't just built into the mountain, it was part of it. Enormous blast doors marked various entrances, while surveillance cameras swiveled silently, tracking our every move. The air felt heavy here, different from the typical mountain atmosphere. It pressed against my skin like an invisible weight. Lieutenant James Hawk Cartwright met me at the entrance. He was tall, with sharp features and eyes that never seemed to fully focus on anything. His handshake was firm but distracted, as if his mind was somewhere else entirely. "Welcome to Outpost 117, Private Mercer," he said, his voice carrying an edge I couldn't quite place. "You'll be briefed on your duties shortly. For now, Sergeant Jacobs will show you around." He glanced over his shoulder, then added in a lower voice, "Stay alert, follow protocols, don't ask questions that don't concern you." Before I could respond, he was gone, disappearing through a heavy metal door that sealed behind him with a pneumatic hiss. In his place stood Sergeant Ethan Zeke Jacobs, a weathered veteran whose face bore the kind of hardness that comes from seeing too much. "Let's make this quick," Zeke growled, already walking away. "Keep up and pay attention. I won't repeat myself." The tour was unlike anything I'd expected. The facility was a maze of corridors, each identical to the last except for the color-coded stripes that ran along the walls. Red zones were strictly off-limits, Zeke explained, and blue sectors housed the barracks and common areas. But it was the black-striped corridors that caught my attention. No explanation was given for those. "What's that sound?" I asked as we passed a particularly thick blast door. A low humming emanated from somewhere deep below, more felt than heard. Zeke's expression darkened. "Background noise, generators, ventilation, the usual. You'll get used to it." His tone made it clear that further questions weren't welcome. The barracks were sparse but clean, with 12 beds arranged in precise rows. Only 4 showed signs of use. "Small crew," I commented. "Optimal staffing," Zeke replied. "Fewer people means fewer problems. You'll meet everyone at chow. Speaking of which," he checked his watch, "mess hall's this way. After that, you're on your own until morning briefing." The mess hall was eerily quiet despite holding about 20 personnel. Conversations were hushed, and everyone seemed to be looking everywhere except at each other. I noticed one woman in a lab coat, her dark hair pulled back severely, studying a tablet with intense concentration. Dr. Natalie Frost, I would later learn. That first night, I lay awake in my bunk, listening to the strange sounds that echoed through the facility. The humming never stopped, but now it was joined by other noises. Distant clangs, the sound of boots on metal grating, and something else, something that sounded almost like whispers coming through the ventilation system. I told myself it was just the wind, just the mountain playing tricks with the acoustics. I almost believed it until I heard the scream. It came from somewhere deep within the facility, muffled by distance and concrete but unmistakably human. I sat up, heart pounding, but none of the other soldiers in the barracks stirred. Either they were all sound sleepers, or they'd learned to ignore such things. Morning brought no answers, only more questions. The mess hall was abuzz with quiet conversation about a power fluctuation in Sector 7, though no one would meet my eyes when I asked about it. I noticed Dr. Frost in an animated discussion with Lieutenant Cartwright. her hands moving in sharp gestures as she spoke. Whatever she was saying, Cartwright didn't look happy. My first assignment came from Zeke, patrol duty with Corporal Amelia Mia Vasquez. She was younger than I expected, with alert eyes and quick movements that suggested she was always ready for action. "Stick close," she said as we began our rounds. "The layout takes some getting used to. People have gotten lost down here." The way she said lost made me think she meant something more permanent than taking a wrong turn. Our patrol route took us through the main research wing, where the corridors were wider and better lit. The humming was stronger here, accompanied by the soft beeping of unseen equipment. Through reinforced windows, I caught glimpses of labs filled with sophisticated machinery I didn't recognize. "What exactly do they research here?" I asked Mia as we passed yet another locked door. She hesitated before answering. "Official story is advanced weapons development, but..." She glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. "Have you noticed how the veterans act? How they never walk alone? How they avoid certain areas entirely?" I nodded, thinking of the black-striped corridors. "There's something else going on here," she whispered. "Something they're not telling us, and I think..." She was cut off by a sudden flickering of the lights. The humming grew louder, then changed pitch, becoming something almost musical, almost alive. "We should keep moving," Mia said quickly, her hand moving to her sidearm. "Sector 4 needs checking." As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The security cameras tracked our movement, of course, but this was different. It felt like eyes were on us from every direction, even from behind solid walls. That feeling would become familiar over the next few days, along with other oddities I couldn't explain. The way certain rooms seemed larger on the inside than they should be. The strange patterns of frost that formed on the inside of windows, despite the climate control. The way some personnel would stop mid-sentence and stare into space, as if listening to something no one else could hear. But it was what we found in Storage Room B that convinced me something was truly wrong at Outpost 117. We weren't supposed to be there. It was marked as restricted, but a report of unusual noise had brought us to investigate. The door to Storage Room B was heavier than it should have been for a simple storage area. It took both of us to pull it open, the metal groaning in protest. The air that rushed out was cold, carrying a metallic tang that made my tongue go numb. "This doesn't look like storage to me," Mia whispered, sweeping her flashlight across the room. She was right. Instead of the expected supplies and equipment, we found what looked like a makeshift laboratory. Stainless steel tables lined the walls, their surfaces covered in strange instruments that hummed with faint energy. Clear containment units filled with viscous liquid stood in the corners and inside them. "Are those organs?" I asked, moving closer to one of the containers. The shapes floating within pulsed with a faint bluish light. "Not human ones," Mia replied grimly. "Look at the size and the structure." She was right again. Whatever we were looking at, it wasn't from any creature I'd ever seen or heard of. The tissue seemed to shift and change as we watched, taking on different forms and colors. A sudden noise from deeper in the room made us both freeze. It sounded like liquid moving, but with an odd, rhythmic quality to it. We found the source behind a partition wall, a large tank filled with what looked like mercury, but it moved against gravity, forming patterns and shapes that defied explanation. "We need to report this," I said, reaching for my radio. "To who?" Mia asked sharply. "Think about it. This is a restricted area, this equipment. It's not in any inventory I've ever seen. Whoever set this up doesn't want it found." Before I could respond, we heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Moving quickly, we switched off our flashlights and pressed ourselves against the wall behind some shelving units. Through a gap, I could see Dr. Frost enter the room, followed by two guards I didn't recognize. They wore different uniforms than the regular security team, with no identifying markers. Dr. Frost moved directly to the tank of shifting liquid, checking readings on a nearby monitor. "The resonance is increasing," she said, her voice clinical and detached. "We're seeing similar patterns to the primary subject." "Is it dangerous?" one of the guards asked. "Everything here is dangerous," she replied without looking up. "That's rather the point. But no, it's contained. For now, though I'm more concerned about the effects we're seeing in Sector 7. The barrier is thinning faster than anticipated. Should we increase security?" Dr. Frost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Against that, might as well try to stop a tsunami with a paper fan. No, we stick to the protocol. Document everything. That's all we can do now. They left shortly after, but Mia and I waited several minutes before moving. Neither of us spoke until we were well away from Storage Room B, in a section of the base we knew was safe. "What do we do?" I asked finally. Mia ran a hand through her hair, a gesture of frustration I'd come to recognize. "We keep our eyes open, document everything, like she said, but privately. Something's happening here, Logan, something big, and I don't think anyone's really in control of it." The next few days seemed to confirm her suspicions. More personnel began reporting headaches and insomnia. The power fluctuations increased, particularly in Sector 7, which was now completely off limits to regular security patrols. The humming that permeated the base changed its tone, becoming deeper, more resonant. It seemed to vibrate in our bones. I started keeping a journal, recording everything I noticed that seemed out of place. The list grew quickly. Lights that responded to thoughts rather than switches, doors that led to different places depending on the time of day, shadows that moved against the light sources casting them. But it was my encounter with Sergeant Zeke that truly opened my eyes to the horror of what was happening at Outpost 117. I found him late one night in the monitoring room, staring at screens showing camera feeds from throughout the facility. His face was illuminated by the blue glow, making him look older, haunted. "You shouldn't be here, kid," he said without turning around. "But since you are, take a look at this." He rewound one of the feeds, showing a corridor in the restricted section. At first, it seemed empty, but then I noticed movement. The walls themselves appeared to breathe, expanding and contracting like living tissue. As I watched, a figure walked through, literally through, the solid wall, leaving ripples in its wake. "What am I looking at?" I managed to ask. "The beginning of the end," Zeke replied, his voice heavy with resignation. "You found Storage Room B, didn't you? You and Vasquez." When I didn't deny it, he nodded slowly. "Thought so. Started seeing the signs in you both. The way you look over your shoulders, the way you avoid the black striped corridors. Smart. Means you might actually survive this." He pulled up another camera feed, this one showing a massive chamber deep within the mountain. In the center stood a structure that defied description. Part machine, part organic matter, pulsing with an inner light that made my eyes water. 6 years ago, they found something in the mountains, Zeke began, his voice barely above a whisper. Not a crash site, like everyone assumed at first. More like a doorway. Or maybe it found us. Hard to tell anymore. But whatever came through that doorway, they brought it here. Thought they could study it, control it. The image on the screen flickered, showing brief glimpses of something moving within the structure, something vast. Project Nightshade, they called it. The thing they found, it wasn't just alive, it was aware, intelligence beyond anything we could comprehend. And it had abilities, could manipulate matter, energy, even reality itself. The brass saw weapons potential. Dr. Frost saw a chance to push the boundaries of science. Nobody asked if we should. I watched as Zeke pulled up more footage. Personnel acting strangely, walking in perfect synchronization, having conversations with empty rooms. At first, the changes were subtle. Equipment malfunctions, strange dreams. Then people started changing. Not physically, not at first, but their minds. The entity got inside their heads. Started small, changing memories, planting thoughts. Then it got worse. How much worse? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. You felt it, haven't you? The humming. That's not machinery. That's it thinking, dreaming, growing stronger. The whole base is becoming an extension of its consciousness, and we're all part of its experiment now. A loud alarm suddenly cut through the air, making us both jump. Red emergency lights began flashing in the corridor outside. What's happening? I demanded. Power fluctuation in Sector 7, Zeke replied, quickly checking other monitors. His face went pale. No, containment breach. It's happening faster than I thought. The screens began showing chaos throughout the facility, personnel running in panic, security teams mobilizing, and through it all, that strange rippling effect spreading across walls and floors like a living infection. Listen carefully, Zeke grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. Find Vasquez. Get to sublevel 3, storage locker 219. Inside you'll find everything I've documented about this place, about what's really going on, and weapons, the special kind, the ones that might actually work against this thing. What about you? I'm going to buy you time. Someone has to try to contain this, even if it's already too late. He checked his weapon, an odd-looking rifle I'd never seen before. Oh, and kid, if you see anyone acting strange, anyone at all, don't trust them. The entity, it can wear people like masks now. The facility's lights flickered violently as another alarm joined the first. Through the walls, the humming had become a deep, resonant pulse that made my teeth vibrate. And underneath it all, I could hear screaming. Zeke pushed me toward the door. Go, find Mia, get the documents, and whatever you do, stay out of the black corridors. They're not corridors anymore, they're its veins. I ran through the chaos-filled halls, dodging panicked personnel and malfunctioning equipment. The air itself felt charged with energy, and the walls were changing. The solid metal surfaces rippled and shifted, patterns flowing across them like oil on water. In some places, the patterns formed into shapes that hurt to look at, bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. Finding Mia proved harder than I expected. Communications were down, and the facility's layout seemed to be actively changing. Corridors that should have connected now led to dead ends or looped back on themselves impossibly. The few people I encountered were in no state to help. They either ran past in blind panic or stood staring at nothing, mumbling to themselves in languages I didn't recognize. I finally found her near the medical bay, helping an injured soldier. Blood ran down the man's face from a head wound, but his eyes were clear and focused, a good sign that he wasn't under the entity's influence. Logan, Mia called out when she saw me. What's happening? The whole place is going crazy. Containment breach, I explained quickly. Zeke told me everything. We need to get to sublevel 3, storage locker 219. There's information there, weapons we can use. The injured soldier grabbed my arm. Don't go down there, he gasped. I just came from sublevel 2, the lower levels. They're not right anymore. I saw people walking through walls like they were water, and the lights show things moving inside them. A violent tremor shook the facility, nearly knocking us off our feet. The medical bay's windows cracked in intricate patterns that seemed to form and reform into different configurations. We don't have a choice, Mia said, checking her weapon. If Zeke says there's something down there that can help, we have to try. The journey to sublevel 3 was a nightmare. The elevators were offline, forcing us to use the emergency stairwells. Each level we descended, the air grew thicker, heavier with that strange energy that seemed to permeate everything now. The walls pulsed with faint bioluminescence, casting moving shadows that didn't match anything around us. On sublevel 2 we encountered Dr. Frost. She stood in the middle of a junction, her lab coat splattered with something dark that might have been blood. She was reading from a tablet, seemingly oblivious to the chaos around her. Doctor, Mia called out cautiously. We need to evacuate. The facility is compromising. Dr. Frost looked up and I felt my blood run cold. Her eyes had changed. They reflected light like a cat's, but the reflections moved and shifted independently. Evacuate, she laughed, her voice overlapping with other sounds that shouldn't have come from a human throat. Don't you understand? This is what we wanted. Integration, evolution. The entity isn't escaping, it's expanding, and we're all part of the process now. She took a step toward us, her movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Stay, become part of it. The pain only lasts until you stop being human. I raised my weapon, but Mia grabbed my arm. Don't waste ammunition, run. We sprinted past Dr. Frost, who made no move to stop us. Her laughter followed us down the corridor, mixing with that endless humming that now seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Sublevel 3 was worse than I could have imagined. The regular lighting had failed completely, replaced by that organic bioluminescence that pulsed in patterns that made my head spin. The air was thick with a fog that moved against the air currents, forming shapes that almost looked like faces before dissolving away. There, Mia pointed to a sign indicating storage sections, 200, 220, we're close. The storage corridor was a nightmare of shifting shadows and distorted perspectives. Some of the locker doors had melted into the walls, while others seemed to open onto spaces that couldn't possibly exist within the mountain. We passed locker 219 twice before we realized the numbers were changing behind us. "Focus," Mia commanded, gripping my shoulder. "Don't let it distract you. The entity plays tricks with your mind. The locker has to be here somewhere." She was right. We found it on our third pass, a plain metal door that looked remarkably ordinary compared to its surroundings. The keypad still worked, and Mia quickly punched in a code. "Zeke gave it to me weeks ago," she explained as the door swung open. "Said I'd know when to use it." Inside, we found exactly what Zeke had promised. Stacks of documents and hard drives detailed everything about Project Nightshade, from its discovery to the current crisis. But more importantly, we found the weapons, sleek, prototype devices that hummed with their own energy, different from the entity's resonance. "These were designed specifically to fight it," Mia said, examining one of the devices. It looked like a rifle but with components that glowed with a pale blue light. The documents say they disrupt its ability to manipulate matter and energy, not enough to kill it, but enough to hurt it. I grabbed one of the weapons and several spare power cells. "What about the rest of this? The documents?" "We take what we can carry," she replied, already stuffing crucial files into a tactical bag. "The world needs to know what happened here, what they were doing, what they let loose." A thunderous boom shook the entire level, and the lights flickered wildly. Through the walls, we could hear something massive moving, metal groaning and concrete cracking under enormous pressure. "It's in the main containment chamber," I realized. "That's not far from here." Mia finished packing the most important documents. "We need to move. According to these files, there's an emergency exit tunnel on this level. It leads to a bunker outside the facility's perimeter. If we can reach it." Another explosion cut her off, closer this time. The wall at the end of the corridor suddenly bulged inward, metal and concrete flowing like wax. Through the distortion we could see shapes moving, human figures walking through the solid wall, but they weren't human anymore. Their bodies were twisted, remade into something new and horrible. We raised our weapons as the figures emerged fully into the corridor. I recognized two of them as security personnel, but their uniforms had fused with their flesh and their faces. Their faces were smooth and featureless, like skin grown over clay. "This way," Mia shouted, pointing in the opposite direction. We ran as the transformed personnel pursued us, moving with an unnatural fluidity that defied physics. The emergency tunnel entrance was supposed to be behind a heavy blast door near the old storage areas. We found the door, but the keypad was dead, and the manual release wouldn't budge. "Cover me," Mia ordered, pulling something from her pack. It was a small explosive charge. Standard issue for breaching, but I'd never seen one used. She placed it carefully on the door's weakest point while I watched the corridor behind us. The transformed personnel were getting closer. More had joined them, including what used to be Dr. Frost. Her lab coat now rippled like living tissue, and her arms had elongated into impossible shapes. "Fire," Mia commanded, and I squeezed the trigger of the prototype weapon. A beam of pale blue energy struck one of the creatures, and for a moment, its form destabilized, becoming transparent and fluid before partially solidifying again. It screamed, a sound that contained too many voices, all crying out in different frequencies. The blast from Mia's charge was deafening in the confined space. The door buckled and fell inward, revealing a dark tunnel beyond. Emergency lights flickered to life as we entered, casting long shadows on rough-hewn rock walls. "The bunker's about half a mile along this tunnel," Mia said as we ran. "Assuming the layout hasn't changed too much." Behind us, the transformed personnel tried to follow, but something strange happened when they reached the tunnel entrance. They seemed to struggle, as if some force was preventing them from fully manifesting in this space. "The tunnel's shielded," Mia explained, noticing my confusion. "Something about the rock composition. It's in the files. They found natural formations that could resist the entity's influence. That's why they built the facility here." We were about halfway down the tunnel when the facility's emergency sirens changed tone, becoming a single, piercing wail. No, Mia breathed, her face pale in the emergency lighting. That's the final containment breach alarm. The entity, it's fully loose. The tunnel shook violently, dust and small rocks raining down from above. The air grew thick with that strange energy, making it hard to breathe. And through the rock walls, we could hear something massive moving, feel the vibrations of its passage through the mountain itself. "Run," I shouted, though Mia was already moving. We sprinted through the tunnel as the rock walls around us began to change, patterns of light spreading through the stone like glowing veins. The entity's influence was growing stronger, fighting against the natural resistance of the tunnel's composition. The air grew colder as we ran, our breath forming clouds in front of us. The emergency lights began to flicker and die, one by one, leaving us in advancing darkness. I switched on my tactical light, but the beam seemed to bend and distort in the thick air. A horrible screech of metal and stone echoed through the tunnel. Looking back, I saw the walls at the facility end of the tunnel beginning to fold in on themselves, creating impossible geometric patterns that hurt to look at. "It's reshaping the tunnel," Mia yelled. "If it seals our exit." We pushed ourselves harder, lungs burning in the strange air. The cold grew more intense, and ice began forming on the walls in intricate, spiraling patterns. The tunnel floor beneath our feet started to undulate, making each step treacherous. Suddenly, Mia stopped dead in her tracks. Ahead of us, a figure stood in the tunnel, Lieutenant Cartwright. But something was wrong. His uniform rippled like liquid, and his eyes glowed with an inner light that cast no shadows. "You can't leave," he said, his voice overlapping with others. "The integration is nearly complete. The facility, the mountain, soon everything. It will all be part of the new reality." "That's not Cartwright," I warned, raising the prototype weapon. "No," the thing wearing Cartwright's form agreed. "But I wear him well, don't I? Just as I'll wear you both. Your memories, your forms, your very essence, all becoming part of the greater whole." Mia fired without warning. The blue energy beam struck Cartwright's figure, causing it to distort and partially dissolve. But instead of retreating, it began to flow toward us like living mercury, spreading across the tunnel floor and walls. "The bunker entrance is just ahead," Mia shouted. "We have to make it past him." We fired together, our weapons creating a corridor of disrupted energy through the flowing mass that had been Cartwright. The entity screamed in those multiple voices again, the sound resonating through our bones. Running through the disrupted area felt like moving through thick syrup. The entity's substance tried to cling to us, seeping into our clothes and attempting to burrow through to our skin. The cold was intense, like being submerged in ice water. Finally, we broke through. The bunker entrance was visible now, a heavy steel door set into the rock face. Mia reached it first, spinning the manual lock with desperate strength. I kept firing at the reforming mass behind us, but the weapon's power cell was running dangerously low. "Got it," Mia yelled as the door creaked open. We dove inside just as the entity surged forward in a wave of twisted matter and energy. The door slammed shut behind us with a resounding boom, multiple locks engaging automatically. The bunker was small but well equipped, with its own power supply and communications equipment. Through the thick windows, we could see the forested mountainside, and in the distance, the main facility. What we saw made us freeze in horror. The entire mountain housing Outpost 117 was changing. The rock itself flowed like water, reforming into new configurations that ignored gravity and natural law. The facility's structures were being absorbed and remade, becoming part of something vast and incomprehensible. And in the center of it all, rising from the chaos, was a shape that our minds couldn't properly process. A fusion of organic and inorganic matter that pulsed with otherworldly energy. "Look at this," Mia called from the communications console. She'd found an active terminal displaying multiple emergency broadcasts. Similar transformations were being reported at other locations around the globe, places where fragments of the entity had been secretly transported for study. "It wasn't just here," she said, her voice shaking. "They had samples in facilities all over the world, and now they're all awakening," I finished. "Connecting, spreading." Through the bunker windows, we watched as the entity continued to reshape the mountain. The forest below began to change as its influence spread, trees twisting into new forms that reached toward the sky like grasping fingers. In the distance, storm clouds gathered, but they moved against the wind and glowed with that same inner light we'd seen in the facility. "What do we do now?" I asked, clutching the bag of documents we'd managed to save. Mia checked our remaining weapons and supplies. "We warn everyone we can, and then," she looked at me with grim determination, "then we fight, because if we don't, there won't be anything human left in this world." The bunker's radio crackled to life, picking up transmissions from military and civilian channels. Through the static and panic, one thing became clear. This was only the beginning. The entity wasn't just escaping Outpost 117. It was emerging into our world fully, bringing with it changes that would reshape reality itself. As night fell, we could see lights spreading through the valley below. Not fires or electrical lights, but that same bioluminescence that had filled the facility. And in the darkness, we heard the humming. It was everywhere now, a song of transformation that promised to remake everything it touched. The world as we knew it was ending, and we were among the few who knew why, who had seen it begin, and who might still have a chance to stop it. If there was still time, if it wasn't already too late. Mia spent the next hour scanning through emergency frequencies while I studied the documents we'd salvaged from the facility. The deeper I dug into the files, the worse it got. Project Nightshade hadn't just been about containing and studying the entity, they'd been actively trying to weaponize it, sending samples to different facilities around the globe. "Listen to this," I called to Mia. They knew it could communicate across vast distances. Every sample, no matter how small, maintained a connection to the main entity. They thought that meant they could control it from a central location. Instead, they gave it a network to spread through, Mia said grimly. She pointed to the communications display. "I'm picking up similar reports from everywhere. Military bases in Alaska, research stations in Siberia, underground facilities in the Australian outback. They're all going dark in the same way." The bunker shook as another tremor passed through the mountain. Through the windows, we could see the transformation accelerating. The trees had become unrecognizable, their forms twisted into spiraling structures that pulsed with bioluminescent energy. The ground itself seemed to breathe, rising and falling in slow waves. "Here," Mia said suddenly, focusing on one particular frequency. "It's Zeke." Through heavy static, we could hear his voice. "Anyone receiving this, the entity can be hurt. The prototype weapons work, but they need to be modified. The resonance frequency is wrong. Check the gamma files from Lab 7. They contain the correct..." The transmission cut off in a burst of static, but he'd given us something to work with. I dug through the documents until I found what we needed. Detailed specs for the prototype weapons, including calibration data from various tests. "Look at this," I said, spreading the papers out. They were trying different frequency combinations. The ones we used in the tunnel were only partially effective because they were calibrated for the smaller samples, but for the main entity. "We need to retune them," Mia finished, examining one of our remaining weapons. "These can be adjusted in the field. If we get the frequency right, we might be able to actually hurt it." A sudden pounding on the bunker door made us both jump. Through the small observation window, we could see a group of survivors. Actual humans, not entity puppets, desperately seeking shelter. "Military personnel," Mia confirmed, checking through the scope of her rifle. 3 soldiers and what looks like 2 researchers. They're clean, no signs of transformation. We let them in quickly. They were exhausted and terrified, having barely escaped from another facility nearby. Among them was Dr. Victor Kane, one of the original Project Nightshade scientists. "It's my fault," he said, collapsing into a chair. "We thought we could control it, contain it. We never understood what we were really dealing with. It's not just an entity, it's a living bridge between realities. Every sample we took, every test we ran, we were just helping it establish more connections to our world." "How do we stop it?" I demanded. Kane looked up, his eyes haunted but determined. The prototypes, they were based on my original research. The entity exists partially out of phase with our reality. That's how it manipulates matter and energy. But if we can generate the right resonance pattern, we can force it fully into our dimension, make it fully physical. And then we can kill it, Mia asked. Maybe, but we'd need access to much more powerful equipment than these handheld prototypes. There's a facility about 20 miles from here, the Forge. It was designed as a backup plan. It houses an experimental device that could theoretically generate enough energy to affect the entity across its entire network. One of the soldiers, a weather-beaten sergeant, spoke up. 20 miles through that, he gestured at the transformed landscape outside. It's suicide. We don't have a choice, I said. Look. On the communications display, satellite images showed the transformation spreading in growing circles from each infection point. Some areas were still clear, but the entity's influence was expanding exponentially. How long? Mia asked Kane. At the current rate of spread, less than 72 hours before the transformation becomes irreversible. After that, Earth's biosphere will be completely reshaped. Nothing human will survive. The bunker trembled again as another wave of change swept through the area. Through the windows, we could see new forms rising from the transformed forest. Structures that seemed to be part plant, part crystal, part living flesh, and in the distance, moving through this altered landscape, were things that had once been human, now remade into the entity's servants. We need to move, Mia said, checking her weapons. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to reach the forge. Doctor, can you help us recalibrate these weapons for maximum effect? Kane nodded, already examining one of the prototypes. Yes, but they'll need a power source. The energy cells were never designed for the frequencies we'll need. There's a military supply depot about 5 miles from here, one of the other soldiers offered. If it hasn't been compromised yet, they have experimental power cells that might work. I looked at our small group, possibly the only humans left in this region who understood what we were really facing. We had limited weapons, difficult terrain to cross, and an entity that was actively reshaping reality itself trying to stop us. We leave in 30 minutes, I decided. Doctor, get those weapons calibrated. Everyone else, gather whatever supplies you can carry. We're about to walk through hell. As if in response to my words, a low, resonant tone began to fill the air. The entity's humming, but different now. It sounded almost like laughter. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of preparation. Dr. Kane worked on the weapons, using parts from our spare equipment to modify their frequency outputs. The rest of us gathered supplies, ammunition, food, medical kits, and anything else that might help us survive the journey ahead. These will work better now, Kane said, handing out the modified weapons. But be careful with the power consumption. Push them too hard, and they'll burn out completely. We stepped out of the bunker into a world that had become alien. The ground beneath our feet was no longer soil but a strange, semi-organic surface that pulsed with faint bioluminescence. The trees had transformed into towering structures that seemed to be part crystal, part flesh, their branches reaching toward a sky that had taken on a strange, opalescent quality. Stay close, Mia ordered, taking point, and watch for movement. The entity's puppets will look almost human at first, but there's always something wrong about them. We moved carefully through the transformed forest, each step calculated. The air was thick with strange spores that drifted like glowing snow, and occasionally the ground would shift and ripple beneath us, forcing us to adjust our path. About a mile from the bunker, we had our first encounter. A group of transformed humans emerged from behind the crystal flesh trees. They moved with unnatural grace, their bodies partially transparent and filled with swirling patterns of light. Don't let them touch you, Kane warned as we raised our weapons. Physical contact allows them to begin the transformation process. The creatures that had once been human rushed toward us, moving faster than anything natural. We fired together, the modified weapons producing beams of energy that caused the entities to distort and fragment. They screamed in those multiple voices again, the sound making the air itself vibrate. More appeared from the twisted landscape, forcing us to retreat behind a ridge of crystallized earth. The sergeant, who'd introduced himself as Cooper, tossed a grenade into their midst. The explosion scattered them, but instead of flesh and blood, they burst into clouds of luminescent particles that tried to reform. "The supply depot is our best chance," Cooper said as we ran. "We need those power cells if we're going to make it to the forge." The journey to the depot was a nightmare of constant vigilance and brief, terrifying encounters. The entity was learning, sending its puppets at us in different ways, sometimes rushing in groups, sometimes trying to surround us, sometimes attempting to ambush us from above using the twisted trees. We lost one of the researchers when a tendril of transformed matter burst from the ground and pulled him under before we could react. His screams echoed through the strange landscape for far too long, before finally fading. The depot came into view as the opalescent sky darkened into twilight. The building was still largely intact, but the entity's influence was visible in the way the walls rippled and shifted. Strange growths had begun to sprout from the concrete, pulsing with that same inner light we'd seen everywhere. There, Cooper pointed to a side entrance that leads directly to the storage area. As we approached, I noticed something odd about the door. The security panel, it's still working. Kane examined it closely. The entity has trouble interfacing with certain types of technology. Anything hardened against electromagnetic pulses seems to resist its influence longer. "Can you get us in?" Mia asked. Kane nodded, pulling out a security card. I had clearance for most military installations involved with Project Nightshade, assuming the systems are still. He was cut off by a sound that made us all freeze, a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The transformed landscape around us began to shift more actively, the crystal flesh trees bending toward us like curious fingers. "It knows what we're trying to do," Kane said, his hands shaking as he swiped the card. "It's not just reacting anymore, it's thinking, planning." The door clicked open, revealing a dark corridor beyond. Emergency lights cast a dim red glow that barely penetrated the shadows, and somewhere in that darkness, something was moving. "Lights on," Mia ordered, activating her tactical light. The beam revealed walls that were partially transformed, with patches of normal concrete interspersed with areas of flowing, organic patterns. We moved deeper into the depot, following Cooper's lead. The air grew colder as we descended, our breath forming clouds that glowed strangely in the beam of our lights. The humming was different here, more rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. "The storage area is just ahead," Cooper whispered. "The power cells should be in." He stopped suddenly, raising his fist in a warning signal. Ahead of us, in the darkness, a figure stood motionless. As our lights fell on it, we saw it was wearing a military uniform, but its flesh had become transparent, revealing swirling patterns of light and energy within. And it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, each one a twisted parody of military personnel. Their movements were synchronized, heads tilting at identical angles as they observed us. Through their transparent flesh, we could see the light patterns pulsing in perfect rhythm with the humming that filled the depot. "The storage room," Cooper whispered. "It's right behind them." Dr. Kane studied the transformed soldiers with growing horror. "These aren't like the others we encountered outside. They're more integrated, more complete. The entity must have taken them during the early stages of the project." The creatures took a synchronized step forward. Their faces began to shift, features flowing like wax until they all wore the same expression, a cold, knowing smile that contained too many teeth. "We remember you, Doctor," they spoke in unison, their voices overlapping in a way that made my head hurt. "We remember what you did to us, the tests, the experiments. Did you think we wouldn't understand what you were trying to achieve?" Kane's hands shook as he raised his weapon. "I never meant. We were trying to understand." "And now you do," the creatures said. "Now everyone will understand. The change cannot be stopped. The barriers between realities are already dissolving. Soon there will be no difference between what is and what could be." They took another step forward, their forms beginning to melt and flow together. Where there had been distinct figures, now there was a moving wall of transparent flesh and swirling energy. "The power cells," Mia shouted. "We have to get through." We opened fire, our modified weapons tearing holes in the living barrier, but the entity was learning, adapting. The holes sealed almost as quickly as we made them, the energy from our weapons being absorbed and redistributed through its mass. The ceiling, I called out, noticing the pipes that ran overhead, the fire suppression system. Cooper understood immediately. He aimed upward and fired, rupturing the pipes. Water sprayed down onto the entity's form, and where it touched, the transformation seemed to slow, the light patterns becoming sluggish and erratic. It's the mineral content in the water, Kane realized. Like the rocks in the escape tunnel, it disrupts its ability to maintain cohesion. We pushed forward through the gap this created, firing constantly to keep the entity at bay. The storage room was just ahead, its reinforced door still intact. Mia reached it first, punching in the access code Cooper provided. The door slid open with an agonizing slowness, revealing racks of equipment and supplies. The power cells were there, glowing with their own inner energy that seemed to repel the entity's influence. "Get them," Kane urged, quickly. As we grabbed the power cells, a new sound cut through the humming, a deep, resonant pulse that shook dust from the ceiling. The entity's mass began to withdraw, flowing back into the shadows. "What's happening?" I asked. "Why is it retreating?" Kane's face had gone pale. "It's not retreating, it's making space. Something's coming, something bigger." The pulse came again, stronger this time. Through the walls, through the floor, through every transformed surface, we could feel movement. Something vast was shifting beneath the facility, something that made the entity's puppets seem insignificant in comparison. The last thing I saw was Mia's face, illuminated by the glow of the power cells, her eyes wide with recognition and terror. Then the floor beneath us began to dissolve, reality itself seeming to fold and unfold like origami, made of flesh and light. As we fell into that impossible space, I heard Dr. Kane's voice, barely a whisper. "The power cells. They weren't meant to stop it, they were meant to invite it in." The darkness swallowed us, and the humming became a song that promised to change everything we ever were or would be. But somewhere in that darkness, the power cells we'd taken still glowed with their own light, pulsing with a rhythm that felt like hope, or maybe something worse.